Hey guys, tonight we're diving into humanity's oldest and most creative quest, getting absolutely hammered. Picture this. You're a caveman, you've just discovered fire, invented the wheel, and now you're staring at a pile of rotting fruit that smells suspiciously sweet. You take a sip, your world tilts sideways, and suddenly hunting mammoths seems like a brilliant idea. You probably won't survive this journey through ancient intoxication, but your ancestors somehow did, and they left behind some truly wild stories. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing where everyone's listening from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a prehistoric grove somewhere in the Caucasus Mountains, roughly 9,000 years ago. The air is thick with the scent of overripe grapes, and you've just witnessed humanity's first happy accident. A forgotten cluster of wild grapes has been sitting in a natural stone depression, collecting rainwater and fermenting under the warm sun. The sugars have transformed into something entirely new, ethanol, and you're about to become the world's first drunk person 12. The discovery wasn't planned, obviously. Your ancestors were simply trying to survive, gathering whatever edible plants they could find. But when someone inevitably tasted that bubbling, slightly fizzy liquid, everything changed. The warmth spreading through their chest, the loosening of inhibitions, the way colors seemed brighter and problems seemed smaller. This was magic in liquid form. Historians still argue whether this accidental fermentation happened with grapes, honey, or even fermented grain mash. But the result was the same. Humanity had found its first recreational drug. You can imagine the excitement rippling through that small band of hunter-gatherers. Here was something that made the harsh realities of prehistoric life temporarily bearable. The constant threat of predators, the struggle for food, the bitter cold of winter nights, all of it could be pushed aside with a few sips of this mysterious elixir. But more importantly, this discovery marked the beginning of agriculture itself. Once humans realized they could intentionally create these intoxicating beverages, they started settling down to tend their crops. The process was deceptively simple, yet revolutionary. Wild yeasts, floating invisibly in the air, would land on sugary fruits and begin their ancient work of converting sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Your prehistoric ancestors didn't understand the science, but they quickly learned to recognize the signs. The sweet smell, the bubbling activity, the way the liquid would make them feel warm and happy. They began experimenting, mixing different fruits, adding honey, even trying various grains. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of the world's earliest permanent settlements were built around brewing operations. In what is now China, pottery fragments dating back 9,000 years show residue from fermented rice, honey, and fruit beverages. These weren't just random experiments. They were sophisticated brewing operations that required planning, storage, and community cooperation. Your ancestors were literally building civilization around the ability to get drunk together. The social implications were staggering. Alcohol became humanity's first social lubricant, breaking down barriers between strangers and strengthening bonds within communities. Sharing fermented beverages became a ritual of trust and friendship. If someone offered you their precious alcoholic creation, they were essentially saying, "I trust you enough to share my most valuable resource." This wasn't just about getting buzzed. It was about building the social structures that would eventually become villages, cities, and entire civilizations. But here's where things get interesting. Your ancestors quickly discovered that alcohol wasn't just fun, it was safer than water. In an age before water purification, drinking from streams and wells was essentially playing Russian roulette with dysentery, cholera, and countless other waterborne diseases. Fermented beverages, with their alcohol content and acidic pH, were naturally antimicrobial. A cup of weak beer or wine was often safer than a cup of water, which explains why entire civilizations would eventually run on alcohol rather than H2O. The accidental discovery also sparked humanity's first experiments with food preservation. Fermentation didn't just create alcohol, it preserved fruits and grains that would otherwise rot. Your ancestors learned to extend their food supplies through the winter by fermenting everything from grapes to grain porridge. This wasn't just about getting drunk, it was about survival. The same process that created their beloved intoxicating beverages also kept them fed during the lean months. Within a few generations, what started as an accident became an art form. Different communities developed their own signature brews based on local ingredients and climate conditions. Mountain dwellers might specialize in fermented berry wines, while coastal peoples experimented with seaweed-based alcoholic beverages. Each group guarded their brewing secrets jealously, passing down techniques through generations like precious family heirlooms. The transformation from accidental discovery to intentional production marked humanity's first step toward chemistry, agriculture, and even medicine. Your ancestors began to understand cause and effect in ways they never had before. They learned that certain conditions produced better results, that timing mattered, that cleanliness affected the final product. These weren't just drunk cavemen stumbling around. They were becoming scientists. You're waking up in ancient Egypt, around 3000 BCE, and your mouth feels like the Sahara Desert has taken up permanent residence. But don't reach for water. That's a death sentence. Instead, you're handed a clay cup filled with thick, nutritious beer that's about to become your breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Welcome to a civilization that literally ran on liquid bread, where being sober was considered both dangerous and socially unacceptable. Egyptian beer wasn't the clear, fizzy stuff you might imagine. Picture something closer to a thick, porridge-like beverage with the consistency of a protein shake and the alcohol content of modern wine. The Egyptians called it zithum, and it was so central to their culture that workers were paid in beer rations rather than money. A typical laborer received about 4 liters per day, enough to keep them pleasantly buzzed from sunrise to sunset, while providing essential calories and nutrients that their grain-based diet often lacked. The brewing process was surprisingly sophisticated for a civilization that hadn't yet invented the wheel. You'd start by partially baking loaves of bread made from emmer wheat or barley, leaving the center slightly raw and full of active enzymes. These bread loaves were then crumbled into large clay vats, mixed with water, and left to ferment naturally. The wild yeasts in the air would do their magic, transforming the bread-water mixture into a mildly alcoholic, vitamin-rich beverage that could sustain life better than water alone. But here's where Egyptian brewing gets truly fascinating. They developed different beer strengths for different social classes and occasions. Workers got the standard daily brew with about 3 to 4% alcohol content, while priests and nobles enjoyed stronger varieties that could reach 8 to 10% alcohol. The pharaoh himself had access to specialty brews flavored with dates, figs, and exotic spices imported from distant lands. Historians still argue whether these royal beers were actually superior in taste or just more expensive due to their rare ingredients, but the social hierarchy was crystal clear. Women dominated the brewing industry in ancient Egypt, which makes sense when you consider that beer production was essentially an extension of bread making. The goddess Tenenet was specifically associated with beer brewing, and her priestesses were responsible for maintaining the quality and purity of temple brews. These weren't casual weekend brewers. They were highly skilled professionals who understood fermentation timing, flavor balancing, and quality control in ways that would impress modern craft brewers. The medical applications of Egyptian beer were equally impressive. Physicians prescribed specific beer mixtures for various ailments, mixing the base brew with medicinal herbs, honey, and even ground precious stones. A papyrus from around 1600 BCE describes beer-based remedies for everything from constipation to childbirth complications. The alcohol served as both a solvent for extracting medicinal compounds and a mild anesthetic for patients undergoing primitive surgical procedures. You'd find beer at every social gathering, religious ceremony, and business transaction in ancient Egypt. Contracts were sealed with shared drinks, marriages were celebrated with elaborate brewing ceremonies, and even funeral preparations included provisions for the deceased's journey to the afterlife. The dead were buried with miniature brewing equipment and clay vessels filled with beer, ensuring they could continue their drinking habits in the next world. Talk about planning ahead. The economic impact of beer production was staggering. Entire districts of major cities like Memphis and Thebes were dedicated to brewing operations, employing thousands of workers in interconnected industries. Farmers specialized in growing brewing grains, potters created the massive storage vessels, and merchants transported finished products throughout the kingdom. The beer industry was essentially ancient Egypt's first major manufacturing sector, generating wealth and employment on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the Industrial Revolution. Quality control was taken seriously, perhaps too seriously. Egyptian brewers who watered down their beer or used inferior ingredients faced severe punishments, including public flogging and exile. The government maintained official beer inspectors who would randomly test products throughout the kingdom, ensuring that workers received their promised alcohol content and nutritional value. This wasn't just about maintaining standards. It was about preventing social unrest among laborers who depended on their daily beer rations for survival. The brewing calendar was tied directly to the flooding of the Nile River, which provided both the water and the fertile soil needed for grain production. During flood season, when regular work was impossible, entire communities would focus on brewing massive quantities of beer to sustain them through the coming year. These weren't small batch operations. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Egyptian breweries could produce thousands of liters per day, rivaling modern industrial facilities in their output capacity. Religious festivals centered around beer consumption reached legendary proportions. The Festival of Drunkenness, dedicated to the goddess Hathor, encouraged participants to drink until they achieved divine visions or passed out completely. The festival lasted for days, with continuous brewing operations supplying fresh beer to increasingly intoxicated celebrants. Priests would bless the brewing vats, ensuring that the alcohol carried divine approval for the revelry that followed. Children weren't excluded from beer culture, though they received heavily diluted versions mixed with milk and honey. This wasn't child abuse. It was practical. You're pushing through the crowded streets of ancient Babylon around 2000 BCE, and the air is thick with the yeasty aroma of fermenting grain and the sound of clay vessels clinking together. You've just entered humanity's first commercial drinking district, where Sumerian entrepreneurs have perfected the art of turning barley into liquid gold. Welcome to the world's original bar scene, where getting drunk was both a religious duty and a profitable business venture. The taverns of Mesopotamia weren't just places to grab a drink. They were the social, economic, and political centers of urban life. Picture something like a combination of a modern sports bar, city hall, and stock exchange, all rolled into one smoky, beer-soaked establishment. These weren't casual operations run by amateurs. They were sophisticated businesses operated primarily by women who held significant economic and social power in their communities. The Code of Hammurabi, one of history's first legal documents, devoted several laws specifically to tavern regulation, proving just how important these establishments were to civilization itself. Mesopotamian brewing had evolved far beyond the simple bread beer of Egypt. Sumerian brewers had developed over 20 different varieties of beer, each with its own specific ingredients, brewing process, and intended purpose. You could order a light, refreshing brew for daily consumption, a strong ceremonial beer for religious festivals, or even medicinal varieties infused with herbs and spices for treating specific ailments. The most prized variety was called sikaru, a potent barley beer that could reach alcohol levels comparable to modern wine, reserved for special occasions and wealthy customers. The brewing process itself was a carefully guarded trade secret passed down through generations of female brewers. You'd start with malted barley that had been soaked, sprouted, and dried to activate the enzymes needed for fermentation. This malted grain was then mixed with water in massive clay vessels, some large enough to hold several hundred liters of liquid. The mixture was heated over carefully controlled fires, with brewers adding various ingredients at precise interval to achieve the desired flavor and strength. But here's where Mesopotamian brewing gets truly innovative. They developed the world's first quality control standards and consumer protection laws. Tavern keepers who served watered-down beer faced severe penalties, including drowning in their own inferior product. The famous law stated that if a tavern keeper gave short measure or charged excessive prices, she would be thrown into the water. This wasn't just about maintaining quality. It was about protecting consumers in what was essentially humanity's first regulated industry. The social dynamics of Mesopotamian taverns were fascinating and complex. These establishments served as neutral ground where people from different social classes could interact, though strict protocols governed these interactions. Nobles might drink alongside merchants and craftsmen, but they sat in designated areas and were served from special vessels that marked their status. Slaves were allowed in taverns, but could only consume the weakest beers and had to remain standing while drinking. Religious ceremonies in Mesopotamian taverns reached extraordinary levels of complexity and intoxication. The goddess Ninkasi, patron deity of brewing, had her own hymn that doubled as a beer recipe, complete with detailed instructions for malting, mashing, and fermentation. Temple breweries produced sacred beers used in religious rituals, where priests and worshippers would drink themselves into divine trances, believed to facilitate communication with the gods. Historians still argue whether these religious experiences were genuine spiritual encounters or simply alcohol-induced hallucinations, but the participants certainly believed in their authenticity. The economic impact of tavern culture extended far beyond simple beer sales. These establishments served as informal banks where merchants could secure loans, store valuable goods, and conduct complex business transactions. Tavern keepers often acted as witnesses for contracts, mediators for disputes, and even marriage brokers for their regular customers. The most successful tavern operators accumulated significant wealth and political influence, becoming power brokers in their communities. Mesopotamian brewing technology was surprisingly advanced, incorporating innovations that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe for thousands of years. They developed primitive cooling systems using underground chambers and water circulation to control fermentation temperatures. Their storage methods included sealed clay vessels treated with pine resin to prevent contamination and spoilage. Some breweries even employed primitive distillation techniques to create stronger alcoholic beverages for special occasions. The tavern menu extended beyond just beer to include a variety of fermented beverages made from dates, figs, and other local fruits. Date wine was particularly popular among the wealthy, requiring specialized knowledge of fruit selection, fermentation timing, and aging processes. These fruit wines were often mixed with spices imported from distant lands, creating complex flavor profiles that demonstrated the tavern keeper's skill and the customer's sophistication. Quality testing in Mesopotamian taverns involved more than just tasting. It was a scientific process that evaluated color, aroma, clarity, and alcohol content. Professional beer tasters, similar to modern sommeliers, could identify the specific ingredients, brewing methods, and even the brewery of origin just by sampling a small amount. These experts commanded high fees for their services and were often employed by wealthy customers to ensure they received authentic, high-quality products. The legal framework surrounding taverns was remarkably comprehensive, covering everything from licensing requirements to employee safety standards. Tavern keepers had to obtain official permits from local authorities, maintain clean facilities, and follow strict. You're sitting in a smoky Norse longhouse around 800 CE, watching steam rise from a massive cauldron filled with golden liquid that smells like flowers and promises either divine inspiration or complete oblivion. The Vikings are passing around drinking horns filled with mead, and you're about to discover why this honey-based alcohol was considered the drink of gods, warriors, and anyone brave enough to face both battle and marriage negotiations with equal enthusiasm. Mead holds the distinction of being humanity's oldest fermented beverage, predating both beer and wine by thousands of years. The process was deceptively simple. Mix honey with water, add wild yeast, and wait for magic to happen. But Nordic mead makers had elevated this basic recipe into an art form that would make modern craft brewers weep with envy. They understood that different types of honey produced dramatically different flavors, that fermentation temperature affected alcohol content, and that aging in various wood types could transform a simple honey wine into liquid poetry. The cultural significance of mead in Viking society cannot be overstated. This wasn't just an alcoholic beverage. It was liquid courage, social currency, and spiritual sacrament all rolled into one intoxicating package. Warriors would drink mead before battle to invoke the blessing of Odin. Couples would consume it during wedding ceremonies to ensure fertility and happiness. And poets would sip it while composing epic sagas that would survive for centuries. The term honeymoon literally comes from the Nordic tradition of newlyweds drinking mead for a full month after their wedding to promote conception and marital bliss. Viking mead production was a community affair that required cooperation, skill, and considerable patience. Honey was precious in the harsh northern climate, often requiring trade expeditions to distant lands or dangerous raids on wild bee colonies. A single batch of quality mead might require the honey from dozens of hives, representing months of careful beekeeping or risky honey hunting in dense forests filled with angry bees and territorial bears. The investment was enormous, but the payoff was liquid gold that could be stored for years and actually improved with age. The brewing process itself was surrounded by ritual and superstition that would seem bizarre to modern observers. Mead makers would sing to their fermenting honey, believing that the vibrations encouraged proper fermentation. They added various herbs and spices not just for flavor, but for their supposed magical properties. Juniper berries for protection, meadowsweet for love, and bog myrtle for prophetic dreams. Some recipes included more exotic ingredients like dragon's blood resin or powdered unicorn horn, though historians still argue whether these were actual ingredients or metaphorical references to more mundane substances. Different regions developed their own signature mead styles based on local honey varieties and available additives. Scandinavian mead makers favored light, floral honeys that produced clean, crisp beverages perfect for long winter nights. Celtic brewers preferred darker, more robust meads infused with heather and other highland plants that created complex, earthy flavors. Eastern European mead makers developed techniques for creating sparkling meads, using secondary fermentation methods that wouldn't be rediscovered in champagne production for centuries. The strength of Viking mead varied dramatically depending on its intended purpose. Daily drinking mead might contain only 5 to 8% alcohol, suitable for regular consumption, without completely incapacitating the drinker. Ceremonial meads could reach 15 to 18% alcohol content, reserved for special occasions when complete intoxication was not just acceptable, but expected. The strongest varieties, sometimes called berserker mead, allegedly reached alcohol levels comparable to modern spirits, though achieving such concentrations with natural fermentation alone would have required exceptional skill and favorable conditions. Mead halls served as the social and political centers of Viking communities, much like Mesopotamian taverns but with distinctly Nordic characteristics. These weren't just drinking establishments, they were venues for storytelling, legal proceedings, business negotiations, and diplomatic meetings. The quality of a chieftain's mead reflected directly on his status and wealth, with the finest varieties reserved for honored guests and important allies. Serving inferior mead to a visiting dignitary could be interpreted as an insult worthy of blood feud. The medicinal applications of mead were extensive and surprisingly sophisticated. Viking healers prescribed specific mead varieties for different ailments: light meads for digestive problems, herbal meads for respiratory infections, and aged meads for pain relief during surgical procedures. The alcohol served as both antiseptic and anesthetic, while the honey provided natural antibacterial properties and essential nutrients. Some medicinal meads included ingredients like willow bark, containing natural aspirin or poppy extracts for more serious pain management. Storage and aging techniques for mead reached remarkable levels of sophistication in Viking culture. The best meads were aged in oak barrels for years or even decades, developing complex flavors and increasing in value like fine wine. Some families maintained mead cellars with vintages dating back generations, serving aged mead only at the most important celebrations or to honor the most distinguished guests. The oldest recorded mead was allegedly over 50 years old when consumed, though its quality at that point remains a matter of historical speculation. The economic importance of mead production extended far beyond simple beverage sales. Mead makers were high. You're reclining on a marble couch in a Roman villa around 100 CE, watching slaves mix wine with water in precise ratios, while your host explains why drinking undiluted wine marks you as either a barbarian or a complete alcoholic. Welcome to the most sophisticated drinking culture in ancient history, where wine wasn't just a beverage, it was a complex social language that could make or break your reputation, political career, and marriage prospects all in a single evening. Roman wine culture operated on a level of complexity that would make modern wine snobs look like amateurs. The Romans had developed over 150 different grape varieties, each with specific growing requirements, harvest timing, and intended uses. They understood that soil composition affected flavor, that climate influenced alcohol content, and that storage methods could dramatically alter a wine's character over time. But more importantly, they had created an intricate social code around wine consumption that governed everything from dinner party etiquette to political negotiations. The Roman approach to wine strength was radically different from modern practices. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric and dangerous, something only Germanic tribes and other uncivilized peoples would do. Proper Romans mixed their wine with water in ratios that varied depending on the occasion, the quality of the wine, and the social status of the participants. A typical dinner party might feature wine mixed with equal parts water, while religious ceremonies used much weaker mixtures to prevent excessive intoxication during sacred rituals. Wine quality in Roman society was directly tied to social status in ways that seem almost absurd by modern standards. The finest wines, like the legendary Falernian from Campania, could cost more than a slave and were reserved for the wealthy elite. These premium wines were aged for decades in sealed clay vessels, developing complex flavors and commanding astronomical prices. Middle-class Romans consumed decent regional wines, while slaves and the poor made do with pasca, a mixture of sour wine, water, and vinegar that was more about calories than pleasure. The Roman wine trade was the ancient world's first truly global industry, with vineyards stretching from Britain to North Africa and trade routes connecting distant provinces through a network of merchants, shippers, and distributors. Roman wine merchants were among the wealthiest individuals in the empire, accumulating fortunes that allowed them to purchase political influence and social status. The most successful wine traders often invested their profits in land, eventually becoming the aristocratic families that would dominate Roman society for generations. Dinner party protocols around wine service were incredibly elaborate and strictly enforced. The host would personally taste each wine before serving it to guests, both to ensure quality and to demonstrate that the wine wasn't poisoned, a legitimate concern in Roman political circles. Guests were seated according to their social rank, with the finest wines served to the most important attendees. The order of wine service, the types of cups used, and even the temperature of the wine all carried social significance that could communicate respect, insult, or political messages. Roman winemaking techniques were surprisingly advanced, incorporating innovations that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe until the Renaissance. They developed methods for controlling fermentation temperature using underground cellars and water circulation systems. Their aging processes included techniques for clarifying wine using egg whites, filtering through cloth, and even primitive forms of distillation for creating stronger alcoholic beverages. Some Roman wines were flavored with spices, herbs, and even lead acetate, a sweetening agent that unfortunately caused widespread lead poisoning among the upper classes. The medical applications of wine in Roman society were extensive and often dangerous. Physicians prescribed specific wines for various ailments, believing that different grape varieties had different therapeutic properties. Red wines were thought to strengthen the blood, white wines were used for digestive problems, and aged wines were prescribed for elderly patients to restore vitality. Roman military surgeons used wine as an antiseptic for treating wounds, though the alcohol content was often too low to be truly effective against infection. Religious ceremonies involving wine reached extraordinary levels of complexity and significance in Roman culture. The god Bacchus had his own festival featuring days of continuous wine consumption, theatrical performances, and activities that scandalized even the notoriously permissive Roman society. Temple ceremonies included elaborate wine offerings to various deities, with specific wines designated for specific gods based on their supposed preferences and characteristics. Historians still argue whether these religious wine rituals were genuine spiritual practices or elaborate excuses for socially sanctioned intoxication. The economic impact of wine production on the Roman Empire was staggering, employing millions of people in interconnected industries from grape growing to amphora manufacturing. Entire regions specialized in wine production, with some provinces existing almost entirely to supply the empire's insatiable thirst for quality wine. The wine trade generated enormous tax revenues for the imperial government, funding military campaigns, public works projects, and the elaborate bureaucracy that held the empire together. Roman wine storage and transportation technology was remarkably sophisticated, utilizing massive clay vessels called dolia for fermentation and aging, and smaller amphorae for shipping and retail sales. These containers were often stamped with information about the wine's origin, vintage, and quality, creating what was essentially the world's first wine labeling system. The largest Roman wine storage facilities could hold millions of liters, rivaling modern industrial wineries in their capacity and organization. Quality control in Roman wine production was enforced through a combination of guild regulations, government oversight, and consumer protection laws. Wine merchants who sold adulterated or mislabeled. You're standing in a misty Celtic grove around 500 BCE, watching druids bless massive bronze cauldrons filled with ale that's been brewing for weeks under the watchful eyes of sacred spirits. The air is thick with the aroma of herbs you can't identify, and you're about to witness brewing traditions so sophisticated that they would influence European monasteries for over 1,000 years. Welcome to Celtic brewing culture, where getting drunk wasn't just entertainment. It was a sacred duty that connected the living with their ancestors and gods. Celtic brewing operated on principles that modern craft brewers are only beginning to rediscover. These weren't simple grain and water mixtures like you might expect from barbarian tribes. Celtic brewers had developed complex recipes using barley, wheat, and millet as base grains, but they elevated their ales with carefully selected herbs and spices that served both flavor and preservation purposes. Archaeological evidence suggests they were using hops as early as the 6th century BCE in northern Italy, centuries before European monasteries would discover this crucial brewing ingredient. The brewing process itself was deeply intertwined with Celtic spiritual beliefs and seasonal cycles. Druids oversaw the most important brewing operations, ensuring that the ales were prepared according to ancient traditions that connected the physical act of fermentation with spiritual transformation. The goddess Brigid was particularly associated with brewing, and her priestesses maintained sacred brewing fires that were never allowed to extinguish. These weren't casual weekend projects. They were religious ceremonies that required precise timing, ritual purification, and community participation. Celtic ales were notably different from anything you might recognize today. Based on archaeological analysis from sites like Eberdingen-Hochdorf in Germany, these ancient brews were probably dark, smoky, and slightly sour, with a caramelized taste that helped balance the sourness. The brewing process often involved fire brewing techniques that imparted a distinctive smoky flavor, while floating yeasts could produce a light lemon taste that added complexity to the final product. When flavoring agents like mugwort and carrot seeds were added, the resulting beverage had a very different taste from our typical modern beer. The social importance of Celtic brewing cannot be overstated. These were cultures that Greek historians described as having a furious passion for drinking, and being prodigious drinkers and reckless inebriates one. But this wasn't mindless alcoholism. It was a sophisticated social system where alcohol consumption served political, religious, and cultural functions. Feasting and drinking were mechanisms for strengthening alliances, demonstrating wealth and generosity, and maintaining social hierarchies within Celtic communities. Celtic drinking vessels were works of art that reflected both status and spiritual beliefs. Archaeological excavations have uncovered drinking horns capable of holding 9 pints of ale, decorated with gold foil bands and intricate Celtic knotwork. These weren't just functional containers. They were ceremonial objects that connected the drinker with ancestral traditions and divine powers. The most elaborate drinking horns were reserved for chieftains and honored guests, while common warriors used simpler wooden or ceramic vessels. The connection between Celtic brewing and the afterlife was particularly fascinating. Celtic burial sites regularly contain brewing equipment, drinking vessels, and even sealed containers of ale, intended to sustain the deceased in their journey to the otherworld. The famous burial site near Hochdorf in Germany included a large bronze cauldron used for holding mead, along with multiple drinking horns, evidence of what archaeologists call a BYOB afterlife, where the dead were expected to continue their drinking traditions in the next world. Celtic brewing techniques were surprisingly advanced, incorporating innovations that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe for centuries. They understood the importance of temperature control during fermentation, using underground storage chambers and natural cooling methods to maintain optimal brewing conditions. Their use of various herbs and spices wasn't just for flavor. Many of these additives had natural preservative properties that extended the shelf life of their ales without refrigeration or pasteurization. The political dimensions of Celtic drinking culture were complex and carefully regulated. A chieftain's reputation depended partly on the quality and quantity of ale he could provide to his followers and guests. The best leaders were known for their generosity with alcohol, and serving inferior ale could be interpreted as an insult worthy of blood feud. These weren't casual social gatherings. They were political theater where alliances were forged, disputes were settled, and social hierarchies were reinforced through shared intoxication. Modern attempts to recreate ancient Celtic ales have produced fascinating results. Lakefront Brewery in Milwaukee worked with archaeologists to create a recipe based on organic residue analysis from Celtic sites, using barley, honey, mint, and meadowsweet. The resulting beverage was described as smooth and pleasant, almost like a dry port, but with a minty, herbal tinge to it. While the brewer found it drinkable, they doubted there would be a significant market for such historically accurate ales among modern craft beer drinkers. The influence of Celtic brewing traditions extended far beyond their own communities. When Roman legions encountered Celtic ales, they were initially dismissive. One Greek historian called Celtic beer a foul-smelling liquor made from barley rotted in water. However, Roman soldiers stationed in Celtic territories gradually developed a taste for these local brews, and some brewing techniques eventually made their way back to Rome and other parts of the empire. Historians still argue whether Celtic brewing practices directly influenced the monastic brewing traditions that would later dominate medieval Europe. But the evidence suggests significant continuity between ancient Celtic techniques and early Christian monastery breweries. The sophisticated understanding of fermentation, the use of herbs for flavoring. You're kneeling beside a rice paddy in ancient China around 7000 BCE, watching villagers harvest grain that will soon become humanity's oldest continuously produced alcoholic beverage. The morning mist, rises from flooded fields as you witness the birth of rice wine culture, a tradition so ancient and sophisticated that it would eventually spread across all of Asia, creating drinking customs that persist unchanged to this day. Welcome to the world of fermented rice, where alcohol production began not as an accident, but as a deliberate agricultural innovation. Chinese rice wine production represents humanity's earliest evidence of intentional alcohol manufacturing on an individual scale, with archaeological findings showing that Chinese villagers were brewing fermented drinks as far back as 7000 BCE, using production methods remarkably similar to those developed independently in Egypt and Mesopotamia too. But unlike their Western counterparts who stumbled upon fermentation by accident, Chinese brewers appear to have developed their techniques through systematic experimentation with different grains, fermentation vessels, and aging processes. The process of creating rice wine was deceptively complex, requiring knowledge of grain preparation, water quality, temperature control, and timing that took generations to perfect. You'd start with carefully selected rice varieties, each producing different flavor profiles and alcohol contents. The rice was steamed rather than boiled, preserving the starches needed for fermentation while creating the proper texture for yeast activity. This steamed rice was then mixed with a starter culture called, pronounced chu, a mixture of molds, yeasts, and bacteria that had been cultivated and preserved from previous batches. The fermentation process itself was a carefully orchestrated dance between different microorganisms. The molds in the starter would first break down the rice starches into simple sugars, while the yeasts would simultaneously convert those sugars into alcohol. This dual fermentation process, happening in the same vessel at the same time, was a technological breakthrough that allowed Chinese brewers to achieve higher alcohol contents than their Western contemporaries who relied on simpler single-stage fermentation methods. Different regions of China developed their own signature rice wine styles based on local rice varieties, water sources, and climate conditions. Northern Chinese rice wines tended to be stronger and more robust, suitable for the harsh winters and hearty cuisine of the region. Southern varieties were often lighter and more delicate, reflecting the subtropical climate and more refined culinary traditions. Some regions specialized in sweet rice wines that retained significant residual sugars, while others preferred completely dry varieties that showcased the pure essence of fermented rice. The cultural significance of rice wine in ancient Chinese society extended far beyond simple intoxication. These beverages played crucial roles in religious ceremonies, ancestor worship, and social bonding rituals that formed the foundation of Chinese civilization. Offering rice wine to ancestors was considered essential for maintaining harmony between the living and the dead, while sharing rice wine among friends and family strengthened social bonds and demonstrated respect for traditional values. The aging process for premium Chinese rice wines was incredibly sophisticated, involving techniques that wouldn't be matched in European winemaking for thousands of years. The finest rice wines were aged in sealed ceramic vessels, buried underground for decades, developing complex flavors and increasing in value like precious commodities. Some families maintained rice wine cellars with vintages spanning multiple generations, serving aged wines only at the most important celebrations or to honor distinguished guests. As rice wine culture spread throughout Asia, different countries adapted the basic techniques to local ingredients and preferences. In Japan, rice wine evolved into sake, with brewing methods that emphasized purity, precision, and aesthetic perfection. Japanese sake brewers developed techniques for polishing rice grains to remove outer layers, creating cleaner, more refined flavors that reflected Japanese cultural values of simplicity and elegance. Korean rice wine traditions focused on incorporating local herbs and medicinal ingredients, creating beverages that served both social and therapeutic purposes. Korean brewers developed techniques for creating sparkling rice wines using natural carbonation, as well as distilled rice spirits that could reach alcohol levels comparable to modern vodka. These stronger varieties were often used in traditional medicine and religious ceremonies, where complete intoxication was considered necessary for spiritual transcendence. The economic impact of rice wine production in ancient Asia was enormous, creating entire industries around rice cultivation, ceramic vessel manufacturing, and distribution networks that connected distant regions through trade relationships. Rice wine merchants were among the wealthiest individuals in ancient Chinese society, accumulating fortunes that allowed them to influence political decisions and social policies. The most successful rice wine producers often became powerful landowners who controlled vast agricultural territories dedicated to brewing operations. Quality control in ancient Asian rice wine production was remarkably advanced, with professional tasters who could identify the specific rice varieties, fermentation methods, and aging processes used in any given wine. These experts commanded high fees for their services and were often employed by wealthy families to authenticate expensive vintages and detect fraud. The most skilled tasters could determine not just the wine's origin and age, but also the specific season when the rice was harvested and the quality of water used in production. The medicinal applications of rice wine in ancient Asian cultures were extensive and surprisingly effective. Traditional Chinese medicine prescribed specific rice wine varieties for different ailments, believing that the fermentation process enhanced the therapeutic properties of the rice and any added herbs. Rice wine was used as a solvent for extracting medicinal compounds from plants, as a carrier for delivering therapeutic substances to specific organs, and as a general tonic for promoting health and longevity. Religious ceremonies involving rice wine reached extraordinary levels of complexity in ancient Asian cultures. Buddhist and Taoist temples maintained their own brewing operations, producing sacred wines used in meditation practices and religious festivals. These temple wines were often infused with rare herbs and spices believed to enhance spiritual awareness and facilitate communication with divine beings. The brewing process itself was considered a form of meditation, with monks spending years perfecting their techniques as part of their spiritual practice. Modern attempts to recreate ancient Asian rice wine recipes have revealed the incredible sophistication of these early brewing traditions. Contemporary craft brewers working with traditional methods have discovered that ancient rice wines could achieve alcohol levels of 15 to 20% through natural fermentation alone, levels that require distillation in most other alcoholic beverages. The complexity of flavors achievable through traditional rice wine fermentation rivals or exceeds that of the finest modern wines and spirits. You're riding across the endless steppes of Mongolia around 1200 CE, watching Mongol warriors milk their horses and pour the white liquid into leather bags that bounce rhythmically against their saddles. The sun beats down mercilessly as you witness the creation of arag, fermented mare's milk that would fuel the largest land empire in human history. Welcome to nomadic brewing culture, where mobility, survival, and intoxication merged into a single lifestyle that conquered half the known world. Fermented mare's milk, known as arag in Mongolian or kumis in other Turkic languages, represents one of humanity's most unusual and practical alcoholic beverages. Unlike grain-based beers or fruit wines that required settled agricultural communities, mare's milk could be fermented while constantly on the move, making it the perfect alcoholic beverage for nomadic peoples who lived their entire lives on horseback. The process was elegantly simple. Fresh mare's milk was collected in leather bags, mixed with starter culture from previous batches, and allowed to ferment while being constantly agitated by the motion of traveling horses. The fermentation process for mare's milk was fundamentally different from other alcoholic beverages you've encountered. Mare's milk contains lactose rather than the simple sugars found in fruits or the starches found in grains, requiring specialized bacteria and yeasts that could break down milk proteins and convert lactose into alcohol and lactic acid. This dual fermentation created a beverage that was simultaneously alcoholic and probiotic, providing both intoxication and essential nutrients that could sustain nomadic warriors during long campaigns across hostile territory. Mongol warriors consumed enormous quantities of arag daily, not just for its alcoholic effects, but for its nutritional value in a diet that consisted primarily of meat and dairy products. A typical warrior might drink several liters of fermented mare's milk per day, providing essential vitamins, minerals, and calories that supplemented their protein-heavy diet. The alcohol content was relatively low, usually around 2 to 3%, but the sheer volume consumed meant that Mongol armies were essentially functioning in a state of mild, continuous intoxication. The cultural significance of fermented mare's milk in nomadic societies extended far beyond simple nutrition or recreation. Sharing arag was a sacred ritual that sealed alliances, honored guests, and demonstrated the host's wealth and generosity. The quality of a clan's fermented mare's milk reflected directly on their status within the tribal hierarchy, with the finest arag reserved for chieftains, shamans, and distinguished visitors. Refusing an offer of arag was considered a grave insult that could lead to blood feuds between families. The production techniques for arag were surprisingly sophisticated, despite the nomadic lifestyle's apparent simplicity. Mongol herders understood that different mares produced milk with varying fat content and flavor profiles, and they would carefully select which animals to milk based on the desired characteristics of the final product. The leather fermentation bags were treated with specific tanning methods that affected the flavor and fermentation rate, while the constant agitation from horseback travel created unique textural and taste qualities that couldn't be replicated through stationary brewing methods. Seasonal variations in arag production reflected the natural cycles of nomadic life and horse breeding patterns. Spring arag, made from the milk of mares who had just given birth, was considered the finest and most potent variety, with higher fat content and more complex flavors. Summer arag was lighter and more refreshing, perfect for the hot months when warriors needed hydration more than calories. Autumn arag was often stronger and more sour, as the approaching winter required higher alcohol content for preservation and additional calories for surviving harsh weather. The role of women in arag production was crucial and highly respected within nomadic societies. Women were responsible for milking the mares, maintaining the fermentation cultures, and ensuring the quality of the final product. The most skilled female brewers were sought after by wealthy families and could command significant bride prices when they married. Their knowledge of fermentation timing, flavor balancing, and quality control was considered as valuable as any warrior's military skills. The military applications of fermented mare's milk were revolutionary in medieval warfare. Unlike armies that required supply lines for food and water, Mongol forces could sustain themselves entirely on what they could carry and produce while moving. Each warrior's horses provided transportation, food through mare's milk, and even emergency rations, horse meat in a completely self-sufficient system. This mobility allowed Mongol armies to appear suddenly in distant territories where enemies assumed they couldn't possibly survive. The preservation qualities of fermented mare's milk were essential for nomadic survival during harsh winters when fresh food was scarce. The fermentation process created natural preservatives that prevented spoilage, while the alcohol content provided antifreeze properties that kept the beverage liquid even in sub-zero temperatures. Mongol families would prepare large quantities of concentrated arag during autumn, storing it in underground caches that could sustain them through months of winter when their herds couldn't produce fresh milk. Different nomadic cultures developed their own variations of fermented mare's milk based on local conditions and cultural preferences. Kazakh kumis was often stronger and more sour than Mongol arag, reflecting the harsher climate and different horse breeds of the Central Asian steppes. Kyrgyz communities developed techniques for creating sparkling fermented mare's milk using natural carbonation, while some Siberian peoples learned to distill mare's milk into stronger spirits for special occasions and religious ceremonies. The religious and shamanic significance of fermented mare's milk in nomadic cultures was profound and complex. Shamans used arag in divination rituals, believing that the fermentation process connected the physical and spiritual worlds through the transformation of life-giving milk into consciousness-altering alcohol. The white color of mare's milk was associated with purity and divine blessing, making fermented mare's milk a sacred substance used in ceremonies honoring sky gods and ancestral spirits. Modern attempts to recreate traditional fermented mare's milk have revealed the incredible complexity of this seemingly simple beverage. Contemporary researchers have discovered that traditional arag contains dozens of different bacterial and yeast strains working in complex symbiosis, creating flavor compounds and nutritional profiles that can't be replicated through modern industrial fermentation methods. The constant agitation during horseback travel creates unique chemical reactions that produce distinctive taste and texture characteristics impossible to achieve through stationary fermentation. The decline of nomadic lifestyles in the modern era has made authentic fermented mare's milk increasingly rare, with most commercial versions being pale imitations of the traditional product. However, some Mongol and Kazakh communities continue to produce arag using traditional methods, maintaining ancient brewing traditions that connect them to. You're sitting in a dimly lit temple somewhere in the Amazon basin, around 1000 BCE, watching a shaman prepare a mysterious brew that promises to dissolve the boundaries between reality and the spirit world. The air is thick with incense and anticipation as you witness the creation of psychoactive beverages that would terrify modern drug enforcement agencies and fascinate neuroscientists in equal measure. Welcome to the world of sacred intoxication, where getting drunk wasn't just about alcohol. It was about achieving divine visions that could literally change your understanding of existence. Ancient psychoactive beverages represented humanity's earliest experiments with consciousness-altering substances, combining alcohol with various plants, fungi, and other natural compounds that could produce effects ranging from mild euphoria to complete ego dissolution. These weren't recreational drugs in the modern sense. They were sacred medicines used in carefully controlled religious ceremonies, designed to facilitate communication with gods, ancestors, and spiritual entities that existed beyond ordinary perception. The most famous of these ancient psychoactive brews was probably soma, the mysterious beverage described in the Rig Veda as the drink of the gods that granted immortality and divine wisdom to those who consumed it. Scholars have debated for centuries about soma's actual composition, with theories ranging from fermented honey mixed with psychoactive mushrooms to complex herbal preparations containing cannabis, opium, or even more exotic substances. The Vedic texts describe soma as golden in color, capable of inducing profound spiritual experiences, and so precious that it was reserved for the highest religious ceremonies. Ayahuasca, still used today by indigenous peoples of the Amazon, represents one of the most sophisticated psychoactive brewing traditions in human history. The preparation involves combining the ayahuasca vine, Banisteriopsis caapi, with leaves containing DMT, dimethyltryptamine, creating a brew that can produce intense visionary experiences lasting several hours. The remarkable aspect of ayahuasca is that neither ingredient is psychoactive alone. The vine contains compounds that prevent the stomach from breaking down the DMT, allowing it to reach the brain and produce its consciousness-altering effects. The brewing process for psychoactive beverages was typically surrounded by elaborate rituals and strict taboos that governed every aspect of preparation and consumption. Shamans would fast for days or weeks before brewing, purifying themselves through various ceremonies and ensuring they were in the proper spiritual state to handle such powerful substances. The plants themselves were often gathered at specific times of year, under particular moon phases, and with elaborate prayers and offerings to the plant spirits believed to inhabit these sacred medicines. Different cultures developed their own signature psychoactive brews based on locally available plants and specific spiritual traditions. Mesoamerican cultures created pulque-based beverages mixed with various psychoactive cacti and mushrooms, producing drinks that could induce visions of gods and ancestors during religious festivals. European cultures experimented with ergot-contaminated grains, creating beers and ales that could produce LSD-like effects. Though the line between intentional psychoactive brewing and accidental poisoning remains unclear to historians, the social context surrounding psychoactive beverage consumption was radically different from modern recreational drug use. These substances were typically consumed only during specific religious ceremonies, under the guidance of experienced shamans or priests who understood their effects and could help participants navigate potentially terrifying or overwhelming experiences. The goal wasn't entertainment or escape from reality. It was spiritual transformation and direct communication with divine forces. The preparation of psychoactive brews often required extensive botanical knowledge that took decades to master. Shamans needed to understand not just which plants were psychoactive, but how different combinations affected the intensity and character of the experience, how dosage varied based on individual body weight and tolerance, and how to counteract negative effects if participants became overwhelmed by the substances. This knowledge was typically passed down through generations of apprenticeship, with master shamans carefully selecting and training successors who could safely handle such powerful medicines. The physiological effects of ancient psychoactive beverages were often intense and potentially dangerous, requiring careful monitoring and support from experienced practitioners. Many of these substances could cause nausea, vomiting, elevated heart rate, and altered blood pressure, while the psychological effects could include terrifying hallucinations, ego dissolution, and temporary psychosis. Shamans developed elaborate support systems to help participants through difficult experiences, using music, chanting, and physical comfort to guide people safely through their journeys. The religious significance of psychoactive beverages in ancient cultures cannot be overstated. These substances were often considered direct gifts from the gods, providing mortals with temporary access to divine consciousness and spiritual realms normally beyond human perception. The visions and insights gained during psychoactive experiences were believed to provide guidance for important decisions, healing for physical and spiritual ailments, and prophetic knowledge about future events. Archaeological evidence for ancient psychoactive beverage use is often subtle and requires sophisticated analysis to detect. Researchers have found residues of various psychoactive compounds in ancient pottery vessels, discovered artwork depicting obvious hallucinogenic experiences, and identified plant remains associated with consciousness-altering substances in religious contexts. However, the secretive nature of these practices means that much of our knowledge comes from ethnographic studies of contemporary indigenous cultures that maintain ancient traditions. The decline of psychoactive beverage traditions in most cultures coincided with the rise of organized religions that viewed such practices as dangerous or heretical. Christianity, Islam, and other major religions generally discouraged or banned the use of consciousness-altering substances, viewing them as obstacles to proper spiritual development or as tools of demonic influence. This suppression drove psychoactive practices underground, where they survived primarily in isolated indigenous communities. Modern scientific research into ancient psychoactive beverages has revealed fascinating insights into consciousness, neurology, and the potential therapeutic applications of these substances. Contemporary studies of ayahuasca, psilocybin mushrooms, and other traditional psychoactive medicines have shown promising results for treating depression, PTSD, addiction, and various other mental health conditions. Researchers are essentially rediscovering the healing potential that ancient shamans understood thousands of years ago. The legal status of psychoactive beverages in the modern world varies dramatically, with some countries allowing traditional use by indigenous peoples while strictly prohibiting recreational consumption. This creates complex ethical and legal questions about religious freedom, cultural preservation, and the right to explore consciousness through traditional means that have been used safely for millennia. Historians still argue whether ancient psychoactive beverage traditions represent genuine spiritual practices or simply early forms of recreational drug use. But the evidence suggests you're climbing a towering coconut palm in ancient Polynesia around 500 CE, watching islanders tap the tree's flower buds to collect sweet sap that will soon become one of humanity's most potent natural wines. The tropical sun beats down as you witness the creation of palm wine, a beverage so intoxicating that it could reach alcohol levels comparable to modern spirits through natural fermentation alone. Welcome to the world of tropical brewing, where paradise wasn't just about beautiful beaches and perfect weather. It was about turning every available fruit, flower, and tree into liquid intoxication. Tropical civilizations had access to an incredible variety of fermentable materials that temperate climates couldn't provide, creating brewing traditions that were both more diverse and more potent than anything you've encountered so far. Palm wine, made from the fermented sap of various palm species, was perhaps the most sophisticated of these tropical alcoholic beverages. The process required climbing dangerous heights to tap the flower buds of coconut, date, or oil palms, collecting the sweet sap in containers that were left to ferment naturally in the warm tropical climate. The fermentation of palm sap was remarkably rapid and efficient in tropical conditions. Fresh palm sap contained high concentrations of natural sugars and was immediately colonized by wild yeasts present in the warm, humid air. Within hours of collection, the sap would begin bubbling with fermentation activity, and within a day or two, it could reach alcohol levels of 8 to 12%, stronger than most beers and comparable to wine. If left to ferment longer, palm wine could achieve alcohol concentrations of 15 to 18%, rivaling the strongest naturally fermented beverages known to humanity. Different palm species produced wines with dramatically different characteristics and alcohol potentials. Coconut palm wine was light and slightly sweet, with a clean flavor that made it popular for daily consumption. Date palm wine was richer and more complex, often developing wine-like characteristics when properly aged. Oil palm wine was the strongest and most potent, capable of reaching alcohol levels that could incapacitate inexperienced drinkers. Each variety required different tapping techniques, fermentation timing, and consumption protocols. The social significance of palm wine in tropical cultures was enormous, serving as currency, medicine, and social lubricant in communities where other forms of alcohol were difficult to produce. Palm wine tappers were highly skilled professionals who risked their lives climbing dangerous heights to collect the precious sap. The best tappers could harvest sap from multiple trees daily, producing enough palm wine to supply entire villages with their alcoholic needs. These weren't casual weekend activities. They were dangerous occupations that required years of training and exceptional physical fitness. Fruit wines in tropical regions reached extraordinary levels of diversity and complexity, utilizing fruits that temperate climates couldn't support. Mango wine, pineapple wine, passion fruit wine, and dozens of other exotic varieties were produced using fermentation techniques adapted to the unique characteristics of each fruit. Some tropical fruits contained natural enzymes that accelerated fermentation, while others required specific processing methods to extract fermentable sugars or neutralize compounds that could inhibit yeast activity. The preservation challenges of tropical brewing were significant, as the warm, humid climate that accelerated fermentation also promoted spoilage and contamination. Tropical brewers developed sophisticated techniques for protecting their beverages from harmful bacteria and molds, using natural preservatives like certain tree barks, leaves with antimicrobial properties, and even specific clays that could absorb contaminants. The most successful tropical brewing operations were those that could balance rapid fermentation with effective preservation methods. Banana wine represents one of the most unusual and successful tropical brewing traditions, particularly in parts of Africa and Southeast Asia, where bananas were a dietary staple. The fermentation of bananas required specific techniques to break down the fruit's complex starches and manage its tendency to produce thick, porridge-like consistency rather than clear liquid. Successful banana wine could reach respectable alcohol levels while providing significant nutritional value from the fruit's vitamins and minerals. The medicinal applications of tropical fruit wines were extensive and often more effective than temperate alternatives. Many tropical fruits contained natural compounds with antibacterial, antiviral, or anti-inflammatory properties that were concentrated and preserved through fermentation. Papaya wine was used to treat digestive problems, guava wine for respiratory infections, and various citrus wines for preventing scurvy and other vitamin deficiency diseases. The alcohol served as both a solvent for extracting medicinal compounds and a preservative for storing therapeutic preparations. Coconut wine deserves special mention as perhaps the most versatile and widely produced tropical alcoholic beverage. The process involved collecting coconut water from young coconuts, allowing it to ferment naturally or with added yeast cultures, and aging the resulting wine in coconut shells or other containers. Coconut wine was relatively mild and refreshing, making it suitable for daily consumption in hot climates where dehydration was a constant concern. The natural electrolytes in coconut water also made fermented coconut beverages excellent for replacing fluids lost through sweating. The economic impact of tropical fruit wine production was significant in many island and coastal communities, creating trade networks that connected distant regions through the exchange of exotic alcoholic beverages. Certain tropical wines became luxury items that were traded for valuable goods like metals, textiles, and manufactured items that tropical communities couldn't produce locally. The most prized tropical wines could command prices comparable to precious spices or rare gemstones. Religious ceremonies involving tropical fruit wines often incorporated the natural abundance and diversity of tropical environments into elaborate spiritual practices. Different fruits were associated with different deities or spiritual forces, and the fermentation process was seen as a transformation that connected the physical and spiritual worlds. Some tropical cultures developed complex ceremonial calendars based on fruit ripening seasons, timing their most important religious festivals to coincide with the availability of specific fermented beverages. The seasonal variations in tropical fruit wine production created natural cycles of abundance and scarcity that shaped social and economic patterns in tropical communities. Mango season might bring weeks of intensive wine production and celebration, followed by months when communities relied on stored wines or alternative alcoholic beverages. These cycles influenced everything from work patterns to marriage ceremonies to religious observances. Modern attempts to recreate traditional tropical fruit wines have revealed the incredible sophistication of ancient tropical brewing techniques. Contemporary researchers have discovered that many tropical fruits contain unique yeast strains and fermentation compounds that produce flavor profiles impossible to achieve with temperate ingredients. The natural diversity of tropical environments created brewing traditions that were far more complex and varied than the relatively simple grain-based beers and grape wines of temperate regions. The decline of traditional tropical brewing in many regions has been caused by colonization, urbanization, and the introduction of industrial alcoholic beverages that displaced local traditions. However, some communities continue to maintain ancient tropical brewing practices, preserving knowledge and techniques that represent thousands of years of experimentation with the incredible You're standing in a primitive laboratory in ancient Mesopotamia around 2000 BCE, watching an alchemist heat a clay vessel over carefully controlled flames, while mysterious vapors rise through bamboo tubes into a collection chamber. The air shimmers with heat as you witness humanity's first attempts at distillation, a process that would transform simple fermented beverages into liquid fire capable of stripping paint, preserving the dead, and creating the world's first truly dangerous drinking experiences. Early distillation wasn't about creating stronger alcoholic beverages for recreational purposes. It was about medicine, perfume production, and the ancient pursuit of transforming base materials into something pure and powerful. The Babylonians discovered that heating fermented liquids and collecting the resulting vapors could produce concentrated essences with remarkable properties. These early distillers were essentially chemists, experimenting with temperatures, collection methods, and various starting materials to create products that seemed almost magical in their potency. The equipment used for ancient distillation was surprisingly sophisticated, considering the technological limitations of the time. Archaeological evidence from sites like Teep Gora reveals complex, multi-part apparatus consisting of heating vessels, collection chambers, and cooling systems that could effectively separate alcohol from water through controlled evaporation and condensation. These weren't crude experiments. They were carefully engineered systems that required precise temperature control and timing to produce usable results. Chinese distillation techniques, dating back to around 3000 BCE, focused primarily on creating medicinal preparations and aromatic substances rather than alcoholic beverages. Chinese alchemists understood that different substances vaporized at different temperatures, allowing them to separate and concentrate specific compounds from complex mixtures. Their distillation apparatus often incorporated bamboo tubes and ceramic vessels designed to maximize cooling efficiency and minimize contamination of the final product. The breakthrough in alcohol distillation came during the Islamic Golden Age, when Arab scholars like Jabir ibn Hayyan developed techniques for producing what they called al-kohl, the concentrated essence of wine. These Islamic alchemists weren't just trying to make stronger drinks. They were pursuing the philosophical goal of extracting the pure spirit from material substances. Their work laid the foundation for modern chemistry while simultaneously creating the first truly high-proof alcoholic beverages. The distillation process itself was both art and science, requiring intimate knowledge of fermentation, temperature control, and vapor collection. The distiller would start with a fermented beverage, wine, beer, or fermented fruit juice, and heat it slowly in a sealed vessel. As the alcohol vaporized at a lower temperature than water, the resulting vapors could be collected and condensed back into liquid form, creating a beverage with dramatically higher alcohol content than anything achievable through fermentation alone. Early distilled spirits were often called aqua vitae, or water of life, reflecting their perceived medicinal and spiritual properties. These weren't beverages for casual consumption. They were powerful medicines used in tiny doses to treat everything from digestive problems to plague symptoms. The high alcohol content made them excellent solvents for extracting medicinal compounds from herbs and spices, creating tinctures and elixirs that formed the basis of medieval pharmacy. The dangers of early distilled spirits were significant and often underestimated by their producers and consumers. Unlike fermented beverages that rarely exceeded 15% alcohol content, distilled spirits could reach 40 to 60% alcohol or higher, creating beverages that could cause alcohol poisoning, blindness, or death if consumed improperly. Early distillers had no reliable methods for measuring alcohol content, leading to wildly inconsistent products that ranged from mildly strong to potentially lethal. The social impact of distillation technology was revolutionary, creating the first truly portable and concentrated form of alcohol that could be stored indefinitely and transported across vast distances without spoilage. This portability made distilled spirits valuable trade commodities, leading to the development of international commerce in luxury alcoholic beverages. The most skilled distillers could command enormous prices for their products, accumulating wealth and social status comparable to master craftsmen in other prestigious trades. Different cultures developed their own signature distillation techniques, based on local ingredients and technological capabilities. European distillers focused on grape-based brandies and grain-based spirits, while Asian distillers experimented with rice wines and various fruit-based starting materials. Each tradition developed its own methods for controlling flavor, strength, and purity, creating distinctive regional styles that reflected local preferences and available resources. The equipment evolution in distillation was remarkable, progressing from simple clay vessels to sophisticated glass apparatus that allowed precise control over the distillation process. The development of the alembic still, with its distinctive bulbous shape and long cooling neck, represented a major technological advancement that dramatically improved the efficiency and quality of distilled products. These improvements made distillation more accessible to smaller operations, while maintaining the quality standards demanded by wealthy customers. Quality control in early distillation was primitive but essential, as the difference between a medicinal elixir and a poisonous brew could be a matter of temperature control or contamination. Master distillers developed techniques for testing their products, including flame tests to estimate alcohol content and taste evaluations to detect off flavors or contamination. The most experienced distillers could judge the quality of their product by observing the behavior of vapors during the distillation process. The preservation qualities of distilled spirits made them valuable for more than just consumption. They became essential tools for preserving other substances, creating medicinal preparations, and even embalming the dead. The high alcohol content prevented bacterial growth and chemical breakdown, making distilled spirits useful for storing valuable medicines, preserving organic specimens, and creating long-lasting perfumes and cosmetics. Historians still argue whether early distillation was primarily motivated by medical, spiritual, or recreational goals, but the evidence suggests that all three factors played important roles in driving technological development. The pursuit of concentrated essences for medical and alchemical purposes provided the initial motivation, while the discovery of more potent alcoholic effects ensured your kneeling in a torchlit temple in ancient Greece around 500 BCE, watching priests prepare sacred wine mixed with mysterious herbs, while worshippers gather for the Dionysiac mysteries. The air is thick with incense and anticipation as you witness religious ceremonies where getting drunk wasn't just permitted. It was a holy obligation that could bring you closer to the gods or land you in serious trouble with both divine and earthly authorities. Religious alcohol consumption in ancient civilizations operated on principles that would seem bizarre to modern observers. These weren't casual social gatherings or recreational drinking sessions. They were carefully orchestrated spiritual experiences designed to facilitate communication with divine beings, honor deceased ancestors, and maintain cosmic harmony through ritual intoxication. The line between religious duty and dangerous excess was often razor-thin, with participants risking both spiritual damnation and physical death if they consumed too much or too little of the sacred beverages. The Dionysiac mysteries of ancient Greece represented perhaps the most famous example of religious drinking taken to extreme levels. These secret ceremonies, dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, involved consuming specially prepared wines mixed with psychoactive herbs while participating in dramatic reenactments of mythological stories. Participants believed that achieving the proper level of intoxication would allow them to experience divine possession, temporary immortality, and prophetic visions that could guide their future decisions. Egyptian religious drinking ceremonies were equally elaborate but focused more on honoring the dead and ensuring successful transitions to the afterlife. Funeral banquets included massive quantities of beer and wine shared between the living and symbolic offerings to the deceased, creating a communion between the physical and spiritual worlds. The goddess Hathor's festivals encouraged participants to drink until they achieved divine visions or complete unconsciousness, believing that extreme intoxication could temporarily dissolve the barriers between mortal and divine consciousness. Mesopotamian religious drinking involved complex hierarchies and protocols that reflected the social and political structures of these ancient civilizations. Different gods required different types of alcoholic offerings, with specific beverages designated for specific deities based on their supposed preferences and characteristics. The god Marduk preferred strong beer, while the goddess Ishtar favored sweet wine mixed with honey and spices. Priests who served the wrong beverage or failed to achieve the proper level of ritual intoxication could face severe punishment from both religious and secular authorities. Celtic Druids incorporated alcohol into their religious practices in ways that combined spiritual transformation with practical community building. Sacred groves served as outdoor temples where entire communities would gather to consume specially blessed ales and meads, while participating in seasonal celebrations that marked important agricultural and astronomical events. These weren't just parties. They were essential religious observances that maintained the spiritual health of the community and ensured divine favor for crops, livestock, and military endeavors. The preparation of sacred alcoholic beverages often required months of careful planning and specialized knowledge that was closely guarded by religious authorities. Temple brewers and vintners were highly trained specialists who understood not just the technical aspects of fermentation and distillation, but also the spiritual significance of their work. They knew which ingredients were sacred to which gods, how timing affected the spiritual potency of their beverages, and what rituals were necessary to ensure divine blessing of their products. Roman religious drinking ceremonies reached extraordinary levels of complexity and political significance, with different festivals requiring different types of alcoholic consumption and different levels of intoxication. The Bacchanalia festivals became so notorious for their excessive drinking and associated activities that they were eventually banned by the Roman Senate, demonstrating how religious alcohol consumption could become a threat to social order and political stability. The medical and spiritual aspects of religious drinking were often intertwined in ways that modern observers might find confusing or contradictory. Ancient physicians prescribed specific alcoholic beverages for various ailments, while priests used the same beverages to induce spiritual visions and divine communication. The alcohol served simultaneously as medicine for the body and gateway for the soul, creating a holistic approach to health and spirituality that treated physical and spiritual well-being as inseparable aspects of human existence. Sacred drinking vessels and ceremonial equipment were often works of art that reflected the wealth and devotion of their owners. Golden chalices, silver drinking horns, and elaborately decorated ceramic vessels weren't just functional containers. They were religious artifacts that enhanced the spiritual potency of the beverages they contained. The most precious ceremonial drinking vessels were often buried with their owners or donated to temples, ensuring their continued use in religious ceremonies for generations. The social dynamics of religious drinking created temporary suspensions of normal hierarchical relationships, allowing slaves to drink alongside masters and commoners, to share beverages with nobles during certain festivals. These ritual reversals of social order served important psychological and political functions, providing outlets for social tensions, while reinforcing the divine authority that legitimized existing power structures. The temporary equality achieved through shared intoxication actually strengthened long-term social inequalities by making them seem divinely ordained. Different religious traditions developed their own interpretations of proper drinking behavior and acceptable levels of intoxication during sacred ceremonies. Some traditions encouraged complete loss of consciousness as evidence of divine possession, while others emphasized maintaining awareness and control while achieving spiritual elevation. These differences reflected broader theological and philosophical disagreements about the nature of divine communication and the proper relationship between human consciousness and spiritual reality. The decline of religious drinking traditions in many cultures coincided with the rise of organized religions that viewed alcohol consumption as potentially dangerous or spiritually corrupting. Christianity, Islam, and other major religions generally discouraged or banned the use of alcohol in religious ceremonies, viewing intoxication as an obstacle to proper spiritual development rather than a pathway to divine communication. This shift fundamentally changed the relationship between alcohol and spirituality in much of the world. Archaeological evidence for ancient religious drinking practices often survives in the form of ceremonial vessels, temple brewing equipment, and artistic depictions of religious festivals. These artifacts provide valuable insights into the beliefs and practices of ancient peoples, revealing the central role that alcohol played in their spiritual lives and social organization. The elaborate nature of much religious drinking equipment suggests that these weren't casual or informal practices, but carefully planned and highly valued aspects of ancient religious life. Modern attempts to understand ancient religious drinking practices face significant challenges, as much of the knowledge was transmitted orally through secret initiation ceremonies that left no written records. Contemporary scholars must rely on fragmentary textual evidence, archaeological findings, and ethnographic studies of surviving traditional cultures to reconstruct the beliefs and practices that once governed religious alcohol consumption in ancient civilizations. You're sitting in a smoky tavern in ancient Rome around 100 CE, watching wealthy patricians engage in a drinking game called katabos, where missing your target could cost you your reputation, your money, or even your life. The air is thick with wine fumes and competitive tension, as you witness social rituals that transformed simple alcohol consumption into elaborate contests of skill, endurance, and social dominance that could make or break careers in ancient society. Ancient drinking games were far more than casual entertainment. They were sophisticated social mechanisms that reinforced hierarchies, tested character, and provided acceptable outlets for competition and aggression within civilized society. These weren't random activities invented by bored drinkers. They were carefully structured rituals with complex rules, significant stakes, and serious consequences for participants who failed to meet the expected standards of performance or behavior. Katabos, the most famous Greek drinking game, involved flicking wine dregs from shallow cups at various targets while reclining on couches during symposiums. The game required precise hand-eye coordination, knowledge of proper technique, and the ability to maintain accuracy while progressively intoxicated. Successful players demonstrated not just physical skill, but also the kind of refined self-control that marked them as worthy members of the aristocratic class. Failure at katabos could indicate poor breeding, inadequate education, or lack of the personal discipline expected from social elites. Roman drinking games often incorporated elements of intellectual competition alongside physical challenges, reflecting their culture's emphasis on rhetoric, debate, and mental agility. Participants might be required to compose poetry on demand, solve riddles, or engage in philosophical discussions, while consuming predetermined quantities of wine. These intellectual drinking games served as informal examinations of education and wit, allowing participants to demonstrate their cultural sophistication while testing their ability to maintain mental clarity under the influence of alcohol. The social rules governing ancient drinking games were incredibly complex and strictly enforced, with violations potentially leading to social ostracism, financial penalties, or even physical violence. Participants had to understand not just the mechanics of the games themselves, but also the intricate protocols governing who could participate, what stakes were appropriate, and how winners and losers should behave. These rules varied significantly between different social classes, with aristocratic games following different protocols than those played by merchants, soldiers, or slaves. Celtic drinking competitions often involved tests of endurance rather than skill, with participants attempting to consume massive quantities of ale or mead without losing consciousness or dignity. These weren't simple contests of alcohol tolerance. They were ritualized demonstrations of warrior courage and physical resilience that could enhance or damage a participant's reputation within their community. The ability to drink enormous amounts while maintaining composure was seen as evidence of the kind of mental and physical toughness required for success in battle. Egyptian drinking games frequently incorporated religious elements, with participants consuming sacred beverages while performing ritual actions or reciting prayers to various deities. These games served dual purposes as entertainment and religious observance, allowing participants to honor the gods while demonstrating their piety and cultural knowledge. The most elaborate Egyptian drinking games could last for days, with participants rotating through different roles and responsibilities, while maintaining various levels of ritual intoxication. The stakes involved in ancient drinking games could be enormous, with participants wagering money, property, slaves, or even their personal freedom on the outcomes. These weren't casual bets. They were serious financial and social transactions that could dramatically alter the participants' circumstances. Wealthy Romans might wager entire estates on drinking game outcomes, while poorer participants might risk their liberty or their family's security. The high stakes reflected the serious social and economic functions that these games served within ancient societies. Cheating in ancient drinking games was considered not just unsporting but potentially criminal, with severe penalties for participants who attempted to gain unfair advantages. Common cheating methods included diluting wine, bribing servants to provide weaker beverages, or using various substances to counteract alcohol's effects. Detection of cheating could result in public humiliation, financial penalties, exile, or even death, depending on the social status of the participants and the cultural context of the games. Women's participation in ancient drinking games varied dramatically between different cultures and social classes, with some societies excluding women entirely, while others created separate games with different rules and expectations. Upper-class Roman women might participate in refined drinking games that emphasized intellectual skills and cultural knowledge, while working-class women were often excluded from formal gaming activities entirely. These gender-based restrictions reflected broader social attitudes about women's roles and capabilities in ancient societies. The equipment used for ancient drinking games was often elaborate and expensive, with specialized vessels, gaming pieces, and measuring devices that demonstrated the participants' wealth and social status. Golden cups, silver gaming pieces, and jeweled accessories weren't just functional items. They were status symbols that enhanced the prestige associated with successful gaming performance. The most valuable gaming equipment was often passed down through generations as family heirlooms, carrying both monetary and sentimental value. Training for serious drinking games could begin in childhood, with young aristocrats learning proper techniques, strategies, and social protocols through observation and practice. This wasn't casual instruction. It was formal education in skills that could significantly impact their adult social and economic prospects. The best players often employed professional trainers or mentors who could teach advanced techniques and help them develop the mental discipline required for success in high-stakes gaming situations. The psychological aspects of ancient drinking games were sophisticated and deliberately manipulative, designed to reveal character traits and personal weaknesses that might not be apparent in normal social interactions. The combination of alcohol, competition, and social pressure created situations where participants' true personalities emerged, providing valuable information about their reliability, courage, and judgment. This psychological testing function made drinking games valuable tools for evaluating potential business partners, political allies, or marriage prospects. Regional variations in drinking game traditions reflected local cultural values and social structures, with different societies emphasizing different skills and behaviors. Northern European games often focused on physical endurance and warrior virtues, while Mediterranean games emphasized intellectual abilities and cultural refinement. These differences weren't accidental. They were deliberate expressions of what each society valued most in its elite members. The decline of traditional drinking games in many cultures coincided with changing social structures and religious influences that discouraged excessive alcohol consumption and competitive gaming. As societies became more centralized and bureaucratic, the informal social functions served by drinking games were gradually replaced by more formal institutions and procedures. However, some drinking games, you're lying on a stone table in an ancient Egyptian medical facility around 1500 BCE, watching a physician prepare a wine-based tincture that promises to cure your broken leg, ease your pain, and possibly kill you in the process. The air is thick with the aroma of fermented grapes mixed with mysterious herbs, as you witness medical practices that treated alcohol as humanity's first universal medicine, a cure-all that could heal everything from headaches to heartbreak, though the side effects might be worse than the original ailment. Ancient medical alcohol represented humanity's earliest attempts at pharmaceutical science, combining empirical observation with religious belief and desperate hope to create treatments that were sometimes effective, often dangerous, and always interesting. These weren't modern medications with carefully measured dosages and known side effects. They were experimental concoctions based on centuries of trial and error, cultural tradition, and the occasional lucky accident that actually helped more than it harmed. Egyptian medical papyri contain hundreds of prescriptions involving wine, beer, and various fermented beverages as primary ingredients for treating ailments ranging from digestive problems to surgical procedures. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE, describes using wine-soaked bandages for wound treatment, wine mixed with honey for internal infections, and various beer-based preparations for digestive disorders. These weren't folk remedies. They were sophisticated medical protocols developed by professional physicians who understood that alcohol had genuine therapeutic properties. The antiseptic properties of alcohol made it genuinely useful for treating wounds and preventing infection. Though ancient physicians didn't understand the scientific mechanisms behind its effectiveness, they observed that wounds treated with wine or strong beer healed better than those treated with water alone, leading to the development of elaborate protocols for cleaning wounds, soaking bandages, and preparing surgical instruments using various alcoholic solutions. The alcohol content was often too low to be truly effective against serious infections, but it was significantly better than the alternatives available at the time. Greek physicians like Hippocrates prescribed specific wines for different medical conditions, believing that various grape varieties and fermentation methods produced beverages with distinct therapeutic properties. Red wines were thought to strengthen the blood and improve circulation. White wines were used for digestive problems and kidney disorders, and aged wines were prescribed for elderly patients to restore vitality and mental clarity. These prescriptions weren't random. They were based on careful observation of patient responses and systematic attempts to match treatments to symptoms. Roman military medicine relied heavily on alcohol for treating battlefield injuries and maintaining soldier health during long campaigns. Military surgeons used wine to clean wounds, numb pain during surgical procedures, and prevent infection in field hospitals where sanitary conditions were primitive at best. Soldiers received daily wine rations, not just for morale purposes, but as preventive medicine to ward off disease and maintain physical strength during the rigors of military service. The pain-relieving properties of alcohol made it essential for ancient surgical procedures, serving as the primary anesthetic available to physicians who needed to perform operations without modern pain management techniques. Patients would be given large quantities of wine or beer before surgery, hopefully achieving enough intoxication to dull the pain while remaining conscious enough to cooperate with the surgeon. The dosage was critical. Too little alcohol left patients in agony, while too much could cause respiratory depression or death during the procedure. Chinese traditional medicine incorporated rice wine and other fermented beverages into complex therapeutic systems that treated alcohol as one component of holistic healing approaches. Chinese physicians understood that alcohol could serve as a solvent for extracting medicinal compounds from herbs, a carrier for delivering therapeutic substances to specific organs, and a warming agent for treating conditions associated with cold or dampness. Their medical texts describe hundreds of wine-based prescriptions with detailed instructions for preparation, dosage, and administration. The digestive benefits of moderate alcohol consumption were recognized by ancient physicians who observed that wine and beer could stimulate appetite, aid digestion, and prevent certain gastrointestinal disorders. They prescribed specific alcoholic beverages for patients with poor appetite, digestive weakness, or stomach problems, often combining alcohol with various herbs and spices to enhance its therapeutic effects. These treatments were sometimes effective, as modern research has confirmed that moderate alcohol consumption can indeed stimulate digestive processes. Mental health applications of medical alcohol were extensive and often dangerous, with ancient physicians prescribing various alcoholic preparations for treating depression, anxiety, insomnia, and other psychological disorders. They believed that alcohol could restore balance to disturbed mental states, provide temporary relief from emotional suffering, and help patients achieve the calm necessary for healing. While alcohol can indeed provide short-term relief from anxiety and depression, ancient physicians had no understanding of addiction, tolerance, or the long-term consequences of using alcohol as psychiatric medication. The preparation of medicinal alcoholic beverages was a specialized skill that required knowledge of fermentation, herb lore, and dosage calculations that could mean the difference between healing and poisoning. Medical brewers and vintners were highly trained professionals who understood how different ingredients affected the therapeutic properties of their preparations. how aging influenced potency, and how to adjust formulations for different patients and conditions. Their knowledge was closely guarded and passed down through generations of apprenticeship. Quality control in ancient medical alcohol was primitive but essential, as contaminated or improperly prepared medicines could kill patients faster than their original ailments. Physicians developed various tests for evaluating the purity and potency of their alcoholic preparations, including taste evaluations, visual inspections, and simple chemical tests using available materials. The most experienced medical practitioners could judge the quality of medicinal alcohol by its appearance, aroma, and effects on test subjects. The dosage calculations for ancient medical alcohol were based on empirical observation rather than scientific measurement, leading to wildly inconsistent results and frequent cases of accidental poisoning or ineffective treatment. Physicians had no reliable methods for measuring alcohol content or standardizing their preparations, relying instead on traditional recipes, personal experience, and patient feedback to guide their prescribing decisions. This lack of standardization made ancient medical alcohol both unpredictable and potentially dangerous. The social and economic aspects of medical alcohol created complex relationships between physicians, patients, and suppliers that influenced both medical practice and commercial trade. Wealthy patients could afford the finest medicinal wines and elaborate preparations, while poor patients made do with basic beer-based remedies or went without treatment entirely. This disparity in medical care reflected broader social inequalities, while creating economic incentives for physicians to develop expensive and elaborate alcoholic treatments for affluent clients. Modern research has validated some ancient medical uses of alcohol while debunking others, revealing that ancient physicians were sometimes remarkably accurate in their observations despite lacking scientific understanding of the mechanisms involved. The antiseptic properties of alcohol, its effectiveness as a solvent for herbal medicines, and its ability to provide pain relief were all genuine therapeutic benefits that made ancient medical alcohol genuinely useful despite its limitations and dangers. You're waking up in ancient Babylon around 1800 BCE, with a head that feels like it's been trampled by a herd of angry camels, watching a concerned healer approach with a clay vessel containing what appears to be fermented fish sauce mixed with tree bark. The morning light stabs at your eyes like bronze daggers as you're about to experience humanity's first hangover cures, remedies so bizarre and potentially dangerous that they might actually make you feel worse than the original drinking session that landed you in this predicament. Ancient hangover remedies represented humanity's earliest attempts at understanding the physiological consequences of excessive alcohol consumption and developing treatments that could restore normal function after a night of serious drinking. These weren't casual folk remedies passed down through generations of casual drinkers. They were sophisticated medical protocols developed by professional healers who understood that hangovers were serious medical conditions that could incapacitate important people at crucial moments. Mesopotamian hangover treatments often involved consuming additional alcohol mixed with various herbs and spices, operating on the principle that hair of the dog could ease withdrawal symptoms and restore chemical balance to the disrupted system. Babylonian physicians prescribed beer mixed with ground willow bark, containing natural aspirin, honey for blood sugar stabilization, and various aromatic herbs to settle the stomach and clear the head. These treatments were sometimes effective, though they risked prolonging intoxication rather than curing it. Egyptian Hangover remedies focused heavily on rehydration and electrolyte replacement, though ancient physicians didn't understand the scientific principles behind their treatments. They prescribed mixtures of water, salt, and various plant extracts that could help restore fluid balance and provide essential minerals lost through alcohol's diuretic effects. Some Egyptian remedies included ground ostrich eggs, crocodile dung, and other exotic ingredients that probably had no therapeutic value, but demonstrated the physician's access to rare and expensive materials. Greek hangover cures often incorporated the principle of balance that dominated their medical philosophy, attempting to restore harmony between the body's various humors and elements. Greek physicians prescribed specific foods, wines, and herbal preparations based on their understanding of how different substances affected the body's natural equilibrium. They believed that hangovers resulted from excess heat and moisture in the system, leading to treatments designed to cool and dry the patient back to normal balance. Roman hangover remedies were notably practical and focused on rapid recovery that would allow important citizens to resume their duties without prolonged incapacitation. Roman physicians developed protocols for treating hangovers in military commanders, politicians, and other officials who couldn't afford to be disabled by the consequences of excessive drinking. Their treatments often involved stimulants, mild exercise, and carefully controlled rehydration, designed to restore function as quickly as possible. The prevention strategies developed by ancient cultures were often more sophisticated than their hangover cures, reflecting an understanding that avoiding excessive intoxication was easier than treating its consequences. Ancient drinking cultures developed elaborate protocols for pacing alcohol consumption, mixing wine with water, eating specific foods during drinking sessions, and using various substances to slow alcohol absorption or enhance its metabolism. Chinese traditional medicine approached hangovers as disruptions to the body's natural energy flow, developing treatments that combined herbal medicines, acupuncture, and dietary therapy to restore proper balance and function. Chinese physicians understood that hangovers involved multiple organ systems and required comprehensive treatment rather than simple symptom relief. Their remedies often included complex herbal formulations designed to support liver function, restore digestive balance, and calm the nervous system. The social implications of hangover remedies in ancient cultures were significant, as the ability to recover quickly from excessive drinking could impact one's reputation, career prospects, and social standing. Wealthy individuals often employed personal physicians who specialized in hangover treatment, ensuring they could maintain their social and professional obligations despite their drinking habits. The quality and effectiveness of hangover remedies became status symbols that demonstrated both wealth and wisdom. Ancient understanding of alcohol metabolism was primitive but surprisingly accurate in some respects, with healers recognizing that hangovers involved dehydration, blood sugar imbalances, and toxic byproducts that needed to be eliminated from the system. They developed treatments that addressed these problems through rehydration, nutrition, and various purging techniques designed to speed the elimination of alcohol and its metabolites from the body. The ingredients used in ancient hangover remedies ranged from genuinely helpful to completely useless to potentially dangerous, reflecting the trial and error nature of ancient medical practice. Some remedies included substances that modern science has confirmed as beneficial: willow bark for pain relief, honey for blood sugar, salt for electrolyte replacement, while others incorporated materials that were harmless but ineffective, or even toxic substances that could worsen the patient's condition. The preparation and administration of hangover remedies often involved elaborate rituals and ceremonies that may have provided psychological benefits, even when the physical treatments were ineffective. The attention and care provided by healers, the belief in the treatment's effectiveness, and the social support from family and friends could all contribute to recovery through what modern medicine recognizes as placebo effects. The economic aspects of hangover treatment created lucrative opportunities for healers, apothecaries, and suppliers of exotic ingredients, who catered to wealthy clients suffering from the consequences of excessive drinking. The most successful hangover specialists could command high fees for their services, particularly if they could guarantee rapid recovery without unpleasant side effects. This economic incentive encouraged innovation and experimentation in hangover treatment methods. The wisdom embedded in ancient drinking cultures often emphasized moderation, proper preparation, and social responsibility as the best methods for avoiding hangover problems entirely. Ancient societies developed elaborate social protocols around alcohol consumption that were designed to prevent excessive drinking while maintaining the social and religious functions that alcohol served in their communities. These cultural wisdom traditions often proved more effective than medical treatments for managing alcohol-related problems. The legacy of ancient hangover remedies can still be seen in modern folk cures and commercial hangover products that incorporate ingredients and principles developed thousands of years ago. While modern medicine has developed more effective treatments based on scientific understanding of alcohol metabolism and hangover physiology, many contemporary remedies still rely on the basic principles of rehydration, nutrition, and symptom relief that ancient healers discovered through centuries of experimentation. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that humanity's relationship with alcohol spans thousands of years and countless cultures, each contributing their own innovations, wisdom, and cautionary tales to our collective understanding of intoxication. From accidental fermentation to sophisticated distillation, from sacred rituals to social disasters, our ancestors explored every possible way to transform simple ingredients into liquid courage, divine inspiration, and occasionally, profound regret.